In this episode, I host a dialogue between Henry Shukman, British poet, Zen teacher, and author of One Blade of Grass, a Zen memoir, and John Brehm, American poet, and author of the Dharma of Poetry. Henry and John share the stories of their formations as poets, compare the similarities as well as the marked differences in their backgrounds, and reveal the powerful forces that inspire the creative process. Henry and John discuss the purpose and process of writing poetry, reflect on poetry as a means of contact with the sacred, and contrast the richness of poetry with attentional practices such as mindfulness and Zen. Henry and John also perform several of their poems, including Walk the Talk, Swifts, Yahrzeit, and Finis Ter. So without further ado, Henry Shukman and John Brehm. Henry Shukman and John Brehm, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you. Great to be here.
I'm so delighted, over the moon in fact, to be with you both here and that we could come together for this dialogue. Thank you both. Well, how to begin? Perhaps I'll start by quoting you, John, in your book, The Dharma of Poetry. Right at the beginning of your introduction, you say, "This is a book about poetry as a source of wisdom. It argues not that poems are or should be didactic or prophetic, or that poets should be regarded as sages, making grand pronouncements about the meaning of life, but that poems embody and implicitly endorse ways of being in the world that anyone engaged in spiritual practice, or anyone wanting to live a more mindful life, might want to emulate." And then later in that same introduction, you say, writing poetry is by its nature a spiritual activity. Mm-hmm. And I think here we have two separate poetries, the poetry that one reads and the poetry that one writes, and the relationship of both of those to spiritual practice, whatever that might be. That might be something that's worth defining too. Spiritual practice. What does it mean to each of you, and how does that relate to both reading and writing poetry? And Henry, in episode 131 of this podcast, in your dialogue with Rupert Spira, you were describing your initial love of poetry, and you characterized it in this way: as a search for lines that brought something alive within us, some sense of beauty, and more than that, some truth, some kind of natural order of things that recognized something about reality that we couldn't normally see. I guess I would have to say that at the start it was in some sense a spiritual pursuit. If by spirituality we mean coming to an experience or a way of experiencing that's much closer to this moment. So I wonder if we might start there with this idea of poetry, both in terms of reading and writing, as a spiritual practice, and what is a spiritual practice in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so shall I start?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Shall I go first because you quoted me? Or
yeah.
How do you like it, Steve? Do you have a preference?
Go for it.
I mean, I was just thinking, I sort of, I think it's to begin with, like, well, what is a spiritual practice? And John, please, I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say on this, because I'm going to probably tie myself up in knots and fall over myself and stuff. But, maybe... if I just think back to my own early interest in childhood, in poetry, especially probably around the beginning of puberty, actually, is when it really kicked in. I was very interested. I got really interested in what is it to be alive, really, and are there different ways of being alive? I mean, is there my ordinary sense of what kind of how it is to be alive? I noticed that it could change. I could sometimes feel much more alive, much more connected to the world I was in. And so just something about the relationship between myself and the world seemed to be more variable than I'd realized. And sometimes it felt much more thrilling, and one of those times was, the first time I really wrote a poem. But what I think the quote, the bit you just quoted me on was talking about getting into enjoying poetry, reading poetry basically. And I was very lucky to have a friend who's a great poet, Sam Willis. He's been a lifelong friend, and he and I actually, from even earlier than say the age of 13, we got into looking at poetry books in the library and trying to find bits we liked, and knowing that there were nuggets we'd come across that really captivated us in some way. They were just beautiful in themselves, and the imagery they brought to mind was beautiful, but also they woke something up in me. I felt kind of something come alive in me that I wanted to be alive in me, and so that had been going on for a few years. I got this idea that with poetry, it wasn't about sort of sitting down and just reading through stuff. It was about looking for what had some charge in it that woke something up in me. That was what I was really looking for. So I didn't care whether I'd happily disregard 500 lines in the interest of 1.5 lines that just had the thing I really wanted. But then, we had he and I, Sam and I, both had this English teacher who was very encouraging and sort of would get us to try to write poems. And so the idea of writing a poem was also kind of on my radar. But there was one particular evening, I remember, when I was staring out of my bedroom window in Oxford, where I grew up, and I suddenly felt this scene below me was so beautiful. It was just, the ordinary street we lived on with a street light on below and a tree next to it, and the light falling a certain way, and sort of the shadow on the ground, and the houses in semi-gloom, and the night sky above, or the darkening sky above, actually sky rather pale and the world dark below it. And it was just really, it just caught me, the beauty of it, in a new way. And with it came some lines, or a first line. And I just wanted to get that line down, and I did. And another one followed, and another one followed. And I realized they were sort of evoking what I was feeling about this scene. So it's sort of combination of my response to the scene before me and an evocation of that scene being able to come forth in lines of words that expressed exactly that little nugget in me that was sort of wanting to be alive. And it made it all more alive. And it was by the time I'd finished, I knew when I'd finished this thing, and I was trembling with excitement, and I felt awake in the world in a way that I never had before. And to me, at the time, I didn't have the word spiritual really in my vocabulary, but now looking back on them, I think, well, damn, that's what spirituality is for me. It's being alive in the world, in a way that I really feel I'm inhabiting this life that I've been given, whatever life is, and having a different sense of what life is than an ordinary humdrum, sequence of tasks that I'm doing or not doing and should be doing, or something like that. It's a really different way of being alive. And to me, that was, poetry actually was my first real kind of solid manifested discovery that it was possible truly to be alive in the world in some way that felt frankly more alive, to excuse my clumsy language. But anyway, that's enough from me. Sorry. Over to you, John. And
Yeah, that's beautiful, Henry. I have so much to say in response, and what you say very much describes my own experience in slightly different terms, but the feeling of aliveness and awakening, and that just longing to be in the world, as you say, in a different way, in a way that's more alive, more connected, maybe more empathic, more intuitive, more right brain. And I'll talk more about that later, I think. But I'm curious, do you still have those lines that came to you?
I can probably remember them, but uh, actually, I can't remember them. I can remember another poem that was from around that time, but I do have them. I have them in a folder tucked away
Oh,
somewhere on the
that's
scrap of paper they're originally written on. Yeah.
that's
But
wonderful.
I imagine if I dug them out, they might be a bit disappointing.
Well, yeah,
You know.
yeah, probably, but still, but to have that very first moment
Yeah.
recorded is wonderful. I mean, it's great that you managed to keep those lines. But yeah, for me, I grew up in a working class family in Lincoln, Nebraska. Um, Neither of my parents had any interest whatsoever in poetry or really art of any kind. There was not a single poetry book in our house. Um, and neither of my parents went to college. So, and they were very pragmatic people. I spoke about this in the earlier episode that we did, Steve. I hope you don't mind some repetition. But they had grown up quite poor during the Depression. And so, their focus was on, kind of keeping things going and on the material, practical aspects of life. And that was a way of living that didn't appeal to me at all. I mean, I knew very early that I wanted something different than that. And my family was solidly German English background, Midwestern, so not very emotional, pretty tightly held. And that also felt like I knew there was more. Um, and I wanted to find a way to experience that. And so I was born in 55, and the 60s came to Nebraska in the early 70s. They finally arrived a little bit late. But so there was a lot of drug use of LSD and mescaline and marijuana and all kinds of things. So I was very eager to experiment with those drugs, or now I would call them medicines, sacred medicines. Um, and when I did that, it was a revelation. I mean, just to see that, like, this ordinary world, this dull world that you described, Henry, of just doing what you're supposed to do and kind of getting on with things, that there was more than that, that there was this magical quality, at the very heart of existence. And I experimented with that pretty early when I was in the ninth grade, and continued for a number of years. And I wouldn't have at the time thought of it as a spiritual experience, but looking back now, I see that's what it was. I mean, there was a lot of sitting around listening to Led Zeppelin, of course, and that may or not qualify as a spiritual experience. Um, but I think you can't kind of do that forever. And I at some point, poetry presented itself to me as another way of staying in contact with this other way of being in the world, this more connected, more alive, more responsive, less concerned with the externalities of life, and more willing to go under the surface and into the depths. And so poetry just felt like, I mean, I knew very quickly that that's what I wanted to do with my life. I had some of those moments that you describe, just looking at an ordinary street and ordinary houses and feeling this quality of luminosity, and just sensing like, oh, wow, I want that. And I want a way to evoke that through writing. So yeah, my experience is very, very similar to yours. And yeah, yeah. And perhaps it's a template for most poets as they begin. And I think that's, one of the things I love about poetry, both reading it and writing it, is that it allows us to stay in contact with, you might say, the sacred, or the moment, or reality, or whatever inadequate term you might want to use. Um, I feel like poets are, as a tribe, never bought the lie of materialism. and separation. And so being in that world was itself a way of not participating in that particular delusion. So
yeah, that's beautiful. A couple of reflections are occurring to me on that. One is like, so it sounds like your family situation was kind of monolithic, that both your parents represented one way of being in the world, kind of thing.
yeah,
And so that was something in you knew it needed to find an alternative.
yeah, yeah,
And then that alternative presented itself in a certain way in the counterculture when
yeah.
the ripples of that reached Nebraska, something like that.
Yeah,
But it's interesting. I can see parallels and also slightly different but manifestation for me. And something really similar was that, my two parents were from extremely different backgrounds. My mum was British, Scottish, English, from a line of sort of professional people, lawyers on her dad's side, and so on. Very, very sort of trad bourgeois, UK, and my dad was from a working class Jewish immigrant family, all of whom were tailors, except for him. He had managed to get, and during his national service, he got siphoned off into a special program that was teaching young men and women Russian at the beginning of the Cold War, when there was a shortage of Russian speakers. And from that, he went to university and met my mum and had a completely different life than the rest of his family. But they were culturally and and temperamentally not a single culture, really. They were different, and their marriage broke up. And I think in a way there was kind of a there were lots of things about that were difficult, but there was also kind of a gap in the sense that I wasn't clearly aligned with any sort of way one ought to be, if you see what I mean. So I had a certain inner freedom there, I think,
yeah,
if I may put it that way, but also associated difficulties as well. It was quite traumatic in some ways, my childhood, through the absence of my dad and the difficult some personality issues my mum has, and also I had a very severe skin condition throughout my childhood. But all that aside, when I started getting into poetry with this friend Sam, who was a key component of that, really, we were getting inspired particularly by, well, the Imagist poets of London, of whom Pound and Eliot counted themselves in that crew, but there were also a whole load of English poets as well. It was all London-based, and all of them, professed to be in some ways inspired by the Tang dynasty Chinese poets. And those poets, who we got into as well, they embodied exactly what you're talking about, that this life where you're not so engaged with the worldly stuff of the court life, the bureaucratic life of China at that time, and the kind of making your way in society and kind of life, but much more concerned with the intimate relationship with the world, and especially with the landscape, and sort of being part of a landscape, and poetry as a means of really sort of studying and being engaged with and kind of sensing what it is to be alive in this world, and then expressing that. So you've got the dual aspect of really the poetry helping you to sense what it is, and to sense that those levels of connection. You put it very well, connected, intuitive, and so on. You just said, and the luminous quality sometimes things have. So what I think we were tuning into was, yeah, all of that possibility from those wondering, non, I don't know, society engaged early Chinese poets. And of course, those in their turn, they had influenced the beats, Snyder and Kerouac, etc. And as the beats influenced us, and this idea that you could live a really different kind of life than what we were basically being presented with as a path in life, and poetry being the thread and the medium and the atmosphere really that could make that different way of living make sense. Yeah.
And just create an opening for that, like just to see like, oh, it can be done. These people are doing it. I love what you say about a more intimate relationship with the landscape or with the world. That quality of intimacy I think is really important aspect of poetry. And I think for me too, I was influenced early on, especially by Williams, and some of the other Imagist poets. I don't know that I was aware of the Chinese poets directly so much at that time, but their influence on people like James Wright, who I read very deeply, and Robert Bly, and certainly Williams. But that quality of attention that they brought to their experience, that for me was really inspiring, because I had convinced myself that there was nothing interesting whatsoever about Nebraska. It was just, ordinary towns, and then, just miles and miles of cornfields. And I was very attracted to the mountains of Colorado, and my father had relatives out west, and we would drive out to California in the summer and go through these spectacular landscapes that were just almost overwhelming in their beauty. And so in Nebraska, by contrast, just felt like, well, there's nothing here. Like there's nothing worth paying attention to. And when I started writing poetry, that all changed. It's like, oh, suddenly, a fence post, fascinating, or a piece of junk that somebody put out in the back alley, something that was discarded, something in the kind of the Bardo realm between usefulness and trash. But anyway, all these things, I felt like, well, it's the quality of attention that you bring. It's not the object or the experience itself. It's, can you, see the world in a different way that takes you to that place of aliveness, or creates that sense of aliveness within you that you spoke about so beautifully. So yeah, there too, another interesting parallel that those were the poets who initially kind of lit that flame. And also Williams was not intimidating, of course. His poems were like, oh, I could do something like that. I couldn't write The Wasteland, but that was also very refreshing, because like most people, I had the sense that poetry was this arcane, immensely difficult art that nobody could really understand. And Williams was a refreshing reminder that that's not the case. So,
yeah. I can very much relate to that thing of finding that the most sort of ordinary things could be full of beauty. I remember that being a big thing for me early on, my early poetic days. I'd be looking for a certain sort of atmosphere that a cat sitting under a bush in the rain or something, or just a lamppost on its own on the corner of a street and nobody around, or just very ordinary things, but they've got a certain aura around them that I would recognize as, oh, that's what I'm looking for. That's the thing. Because it would light something up in me. And it didn't need to be anything exceptional at all. It was a different way of looking. But I don't think I was smart enough, actually, thinking back to that time. I don't think I was smart enough to recognize that it was about my own quality of attention. I felt more that I was looking for the things that had that.
Uh-huh.
I didn't, but I think you're absolutely right. It really is about our own quality of attention.
Yeah,
Because
and I wouldn't have been able to express that idea or to be aware of that back then. I'm retrospectively kind of seeing that that's what I was kind of discovering without knowing it. But I also had that feeling of looking. I used to, when I was, a teenager, I would sneak out of the house at like 1 o'clock in the morning just to walk around the neighborhoods because at that time of night, I would often have that experience, like some house or lamppost or some ordinary thing would suddenly be kind of seemed like it was like lit from within and
oh,
had this extraordinary quality. And I loved it. I mean, it was just beautiful. But again, it was almost, I think maybe even better that it came from ordinary things where you weren't expecting it, like, oh, that weed is
yes.
beautiful.
Oh God, yes, yes. And that vacant lot.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I'm remembering also that and that's something else I want to ask you about, actually, meaning Sam and we looked for, I think maybe it's a natural thing at that age when kids are trying to find their own space in the world. We looked for places that nobody else was interested in. The back alley with just,
Yeah,
garbage bins in it. We
yeah,
loved it in the way that we didn't like the high street, and
yeah,
and a little yard that, has got an old overgrown, a rake standing there that weeds are grown over. It hasn't been used in so long. We liked those sort of unused places, abandoned places. That was where we felt at home. And
yeah.
we found something of that quality there. But hey, I wanted to,
But can I just respond? Because that
yeah,
was very
please, please, yeah.
funny. uh, uh, the first apartment I lived in when I moved out of my parents' house when I was just in college, and there were still some dirt alleyways behind the houses, and I loved them. And it was just that sense of like, this is disregarded by everybody, and to see these broken down, cars or, rusted bicycles or tools or, paint cans or whatever. Yeah, that was the world that I loved. And I still long for that. I long to be in a place that has those kind of alleyways. It's a little hard to find these days. And I wouldn't have had this term in my vocabulary, but there was a wabi-sabi quality
Yes.
in objects that were, sort of lowly and
Yes.
disintegrating, had this kind of melancholy quality to them. I very much resonated with that, and so everything you said just feels like, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah, that's beautiful. Just riffing on that, I mean, I'm thinking it's for somehow the quality of neglect was beautiful. It's
exactly.
because other people aren't interested. That's
Yeah,
where I want to be. I wonder if there's some kind of affiliation or a kinship a poet feels with
yeah,
the neglected, that we want to that's where we belong, and that we want to resurrect that. We want to bring that to light, the very fact that it's kind of being allowed to be itself because people aren't messing with it.
right,
That's sort of, that's, even though it's an ordinary human object,
yeah,
you know there's something about it being clearly abandoned,
yeah, cast out.
cast out, yeah, that makes it kin for the
Yeah,
poet. I
yeah.
wonder if there's something to that.
Oh, yeah, I think
Yeah,
so for
yeah,
sure. For me, there is anyway. And
yeah.
you're talking about the neglected things and being attracted to the neglected, and there's no better way than to be neglected than to become a poet, right? I mean, so maybe it's
Exactly.
that's the kinship.
Except for the extremely rare poor poet who becomes a public poet.
Yeah,
The challenge of being, oh, it's a, yeah, we wouldn't wish it on anyone, really.
yeah. There's a great
But
quote by Philip Larkin in one of his letters. He talks about how some poets, you know, will make a living as a poet, going around and giving readings and workshops and writer in residence and things. He said, I would hate that. that doesn't appeal to me at all. He said, I would hate to go around pretending to be me.
Yes, yes, yes. But hey, here's what that was something was bubbling up for me a moment ago was like, did you have an ally or a colleague or a companion in arms at,
Mm.
is that something? Because I know that I mentioned Sam Willis. It was critical for me to have.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Well, I don't know what would. Maybe it wasn't as critical as I think, but it seemed when I look back on it anyway, it seems like it was so good to have somebody else who was interested in the same search. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't at first. And in fact, my parents were not encouraging about my poetry writing initially. And I remember my father, I think they saw it as a kind of bizarre waste of time. And my father at one point suggested I go to a trade school. He himself was a carpenter and he had been a mechanic and he could fix anything. And, he was great with that kind of thing. And anyway, but that gives you a sense of how like not attuned they were to, the kind of person I was. I mean, I was a dreamy kid who was, not good with practical stuff, but they sort of wanted that. So for me, in some ways, that was a good thing. I don't think I would have done well if I had parents who were really encouraging me to write poetry, because it was kind of a way of defining myself against their way of being. And I mean, they were wonderful people and smart people, but they just were not artistic or literary in any way. And so my writing poetry was a very odd thing to do in their eyes. And I didn't have any friends who were interested in poetry initially. But when I went to college, I was very lucky to have my first poetry teacher was wonderful. And he was incredibly enthusiastic and he was just passionate about poetry. I mean, he was just on fire with it. And that was huge. And he was only about 10 years older than me. So, um, so in that sense, I found very early someone who, read all my poems and would turn me on to different poets. And that was crucial. I'm not sure how my path would have unfolded if it hadn't been for him. So in that sense, I did have somebody like your friend. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, were you at college in Nebraska or out of state?
Yeah, I went to undergrad at the University of Nebraska, and then I went to grad school at Cornell, and I
Right.
studied R Ammons out there, and that also was a huge, incredible gift. Yeah.
Right. Right. Right.
Mm.
Mm.
Something in what both of you are saying about this relationship of the poet to writing poetry. What about, and I say this as a non-poet, a sort of, poet muggle, if you will. What about the relationship of the poet to the audience? Does the poet just write for himself? Or is there a sense of writing for an audience? And the audience, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 different sorts of audiences. There's the audience, there's the cultural, you've both, the historical. You're sort of participating in that, right back to the Tang dynasty in your case, Henry, and in reaction to all these sorts of socioeconomic circumstances and ways of being that you were surrounded by, John. So there's sort of dialoguing in a way with that stuff, or participating in it somehow, even if reacting against it. But then also there's a sense, I presume, does a poet expect to be read? Are there financial thoughts of legacy or thoughts of notoriety, or does that enter into the process? And how does that interact with this deeply, almost, what can we say, personal, transcendent, or immanent relationship of the poet to the writing process?
I'll let you go first, Henry, so I can have some time to think of something interesting to say. I'll try to listen to you as well.
Well, look, speaking for myself, I would say anytime I try to write a poem for any reason, including that I want to write a poem, it won't work.
Exactly.
It only works to the small extent that any of mine do work, which is an open question for others to decide. You know, when I feel they've worked is when there's absolutely no purpose to it. You know, it is just its own expression. And, you know, so purpose, including any putative audience. But then it got me thinking, just, I know that because there's something in me that recognizes if it's a false note, you know, and so that's some kind of quote unquote audience, you know, that isn't exactly my ordinary sense of self, you know. And so I wonder, I mean, you could get grandiose and say it's written for nothing but, you know, the creation itself, or, you know, or a god or something, you know. But I mean, I wouldn't put it in those terms. But there is some sense that I have to be letting go of any of my ideas about what a good poem is. You know, the most fatal thing for me is if I try to write a good poem, you know, fatal for any poem, that is, you know. So it's, I don't know, it's, I can't, I sort of want to say definitely no audience in mind, but somehow I feel that's not exactly right, because there's some sense of something in me that's wanting to be satisfied, you know, and that recognizes if it is or it isn't. But maybe I need to say a little bit about my own process, actually, to make sense of this, which is that I tend to get an inkling of a poem, and some of them I don't get to in time and they're gone, and some of them I do get to in time, and something happens, you know, something appears on the page, and I tend to want it to come kind of by itself, you know, but then I might actually tinker with it for years even, you know. But I hope that it will end up feeling as spontaneous as the first iteration of it did, although I've actually tinkered with it a bit. I mean, maybe a bit, but a lot. Little things a lot. I'll revisit it repeatedly, and can I read it straight through without a glitch? No, there's something wrong there, you know. And then it might take, again, even years to iron out whatever that is, to a point where I feel I can read it smoothly without getting caught on something. So that initial so I suppose there is a sort of successive audiencing that I do of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not thinking of a putative external audience. No. How about you, John?
Yeah, no, I feel much the same way. And you know, you were talking about that different part of you that recognizes when you a false note. And I think that you know, one way to describe that for me anyway is to see it as a kind of internalized composite of all the poetry that you've read that you love. Like you've somehow absorbed a certain kind of aesthetic, or just, I mean, not like rules of what to do and what not to do, but a sense on some maybe subconscious level that, like, you know, Wordsworth would not like that line, you know, or something like that. You know, that all those great poems that you've read and loved are in there, and in a way, you're writing for them, for those poets, or you're writing to come into alignment with them in some way, rather than thinking about, like, are people going to like this? You know, when you're writing something, I mean, that would be deadly.
Yes.
And of course, you know, most poets don't have much of an audience, really. I mean, it's not like, you know, you're writing a novel that, you know, 1 million people might read. But my teacher, Archie Ammons, had a wonderful comment about this. He was asked who he writes for, and he said, I don't really write to an audience. I never imagined an audience. I imagine other lonely people such as myself. I don't know who they are or where they are, and I don't care. But those are the people whom I want to reach. And I thought that was lovely. I write for other lonely people such as myself.
Ah, that's
Not a
beautiful.
big auditorium or some
Right.
big literary critic, but some lonely person who's looking for something, trying to connect. And yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. I do remember actually once I had this idea that it just popped up in my mind that I was imagining, yeah, that I was if a poem of mine appeared in some small journal and decades later, one of the few rare surviving copies of that journal was in a junk store in somewhere in the UK, and somebody browsing the junk store happened to open up that particular volume and happened to land on my poem, and it did something to their day. That's all I wanted.
Yeah, that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So they're in a place of neglect. The poem's in a volume of neglect. And there's somebody drawn to that place of neglect, and there they
Right.
find something.
And then
And
that
that's,
moment of connection of awakening.
yes, exactly. And yeah, and it changes their day. That's
Their life, maybe.
maybe, yeah. But it's enough if it's just their day.
Right.
In fact, it's just enough if it's just the next 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just this sort of glimpse into like, oh, there's this other way of seeing, of being.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And now I'm just wondering whether, yeah, what's that got to do with mindfulness, and what's that got to do with spiritual practice, and what is the, if there's an interruption there, you know, what is the interruption and what's it interrupting?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
If you see what I mean, like the little pause button that's hit on someone's day,
Yeah.
that a
Yeah.
poem, of course, can produce, you know.
Yeah.
What's that got to do with mindfulness? And
Yeah.
yeah, it seems to me like it's got a lot to do with mindfulness. And it makes me feel sad almost that the word mindfulness for many has become almost like a chore, like a duty. You know, and millions and millions of people are prescribed, you know, workplaces are bringing it in, and all the employees get a subscription to the Headspace app, you know,
To make them more productive.
yeah, and like it's sort of taking the magic out of it.
Yeah.
The whole point is that it's a stray, random reconnecting with your very own life.
Yeah, remembering
Before,
who you truly are, your true self.
yeah,
And I
exactly.
think that's one dimension of poetry that you might describe as spiritual. I mean, I think it is spiritual, that poems remind us of our true nature, that our whole culture is designed to make us forget.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
this idea of a pause, yeah, and there's this concept of the sacred pause, you know, this momentary stopping of just the ongoing momentum of the mind, of just the way of being in the world that's just getting one thing done after another, or being, you know, totally engaged with one's problems and unable to kind of stop and just be. And I think in that sense, like that pause, that interruption is really important, you know. And I mean, I love it when I experience that in reading poems or writing poems. I mean, it's just wonderful and you know, refreshing. And it, like you said, it reconnects us to something really fundamental that we don't see if we're just skimming across the surface of life.
Yeah.
And somebody, I can't remember if it was Joseph Goldstein or Jack Kornfield, one of those great mindfulness teachers, who described the sacred pause as a kind of temporary enlightenment. You know, it's just a
I haven't
moment.
heard it.
Yeah, but because in that moment you're free of grasping an aversion, you know, wanting things to be different than they are. You're in this very receptive, open state, you're in the quality of pure awareness is present, or it's always present. But I mean, you're in it in a way that you're usually not, So
Yes.
I think that's, it's not just about like, oh, reading some poems and then sitting down and meditating on the poem or something that direct, although that can be a wonderful practice. But I think I think it's all about stopping, shifting, seeing differently. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Now I'm feeling a little bit of devil's advocate creeping up in me, which is
We've agreed on everything so far.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think we're going to agree on this too. I'm sure we will, but I'm wanting to correct myself really. The idea that a poem is just for that kind of mindfulness is wrong, Henry, because actually, of course, you can do that by, a little bit of practice, a moment of just, taking a breath if you like that, or maybe you don't like the breath so much. Let me just be aware of this whole space I'm in.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Oh, look at the sofa doing its beautiful sofa thing. Here I am. I'm back. I can do that. But a poem is somehow it's more than that. It's got this rich world it invites us into or something, or it's not merely that I get more mindful. It's like, because there's 10,000 ways of doing that. But a poem, on the other hand, is this incredible artifact that someone's created. And they've probably created it out of a very present state of mind and a very appreciative and alive and maybe a emotion filled or recollected in tranquility, whatever, driven somehow by human experience and some meeting of the human drama with a moment, and has produced this beautiful expression of the richness of human life in the world. That's much more than just the pause button. Again, I'm talking to myself, Henry. Note this, please. Because isn't that the case? So we mustn't reduce it to just that, because it's a thing of beauty. Listening to a bit of Beethoven, it's not just about mindfulness. It's, my gosh, there's this whole engagement with the world and with what a human life is. And the amazing thing about poetry, I think, is that it can do it in such a small space that great poems, condense the human drama and the beauty and the catastrophe and all of it, and loss and grief and triumph and suffering and love and, all of it can be in a little poem. Now, how the hell does somebody do that?
Yeah, how is that even possible?
How is that even possible? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Because poems, as you say, are artifacts. I mean, they're works of art, they're created, they're not, and they do more than allow us to kind of pause and enter this mindful state. And they exist in language. I mean, they're embodied in language. And there's something about the immersive experience of reading a great poem that everything's involved, right? Your mind's involved, but emotionally you're engaged. The sensual qualities of the language, the music, the rhythm, all these things that are not totally unique to poetry, but that manifest in poetry in a way that in a more condensed or intense way than they do in prose. Like, that's part of what makes poetry such a transportive experience. And when that's done well, when you read a beautiful line of poetry, I mean, it's incredible. And it's not because of what it does, but what it is. And just, I don't know how to say it, but it's and that's one thing. I mean, this is a little different subject, but I wish more poetry teachers in traditional academic settings would concentrate more on that, on saying what they love about poetry, and not be so focused on these more scholarly approaches. But yeah, I agree totally that there, and maybe it's hard to describe, you know, all that a great poem can do. But I think, you know, one of the things it does that's sort of paradoxical is it uses language to take us beyond language, to take us someplace where language can't really go, but it's through language that we get there. And that, I think, is an extraordinary experience when that happens.
Yes, it's like a great poem. Evokes what can't be put into words.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, this is maybe it's a little bit of a little tangential, but I'm not sure. Let me just throw it out there. Gosh, wait, let me just marshal the thought. It's a little bit complex. Maybe it's not so complex, but there's in contemporary systems thinking, complexity science, there's some notion that complex systems self-generate, that autopoiesis, they even use that term, autopoiesis. And there's even a thought that life or metabolisms back in the ocean fumaroles, in the deep ocean, the black smokers, they call them, where they think proteins and the most primitive organisms first formed. They think they started as metabolisms. This is one thought about it. And they self-metabolized and then continued metabolizing, meaning they continued doing the process of ingesting and turning what they ingested into energy. And so I've heard a complexity scientist say maybe poems are like that. They're sometimes when a poet contacts a poem, they've contacted a little self-generating system, a little auto-poetic system, and they're merely the kind of context in which the poet is the context in which that auto-poetic function can happen, so that we're just a host for something better than us, so to speak, or more than we could ever produce ourselves, to generate itself. I mean, I don't know whether this is. I'm just thinking, like, why am I bringing that in? We were talking about because language as well. Well, in one school of thought, it's this is getting a bit out there maybe, but it's a memetic. It's memes, in Richard Dawkins's term, these cultural equivalents of genes. Languages are meme systems, and maybe they get their fulfillment in a poem, that a language finds its own way to its complete fulfillment, doing all it can do. Granted that it has these hosts, these human hosts with all it needs the human hosts, the language system obviously does, and it can harvest all it can get out of a human and the human experience and generate this little marvel that is the best language can be, the ultimate that language can be. But it's kind of sort of generating itself.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bit wild, but I don't know.
No, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. I think that's quite true. The poet is like a conduit, or like, as you say, a host, but it's something else that's coming through. And yeah, I love that idea of kind of self-organizing, because of course, I'm sure you know this, when you're feeling, truly inspired, it doesn't feel like you're writing the poem, right? I mean, it feels like it's coming through you.
Yeah.
But the idea that language is using us to find its highest perfection, maybe that's not the right word, but its most complete expression. That's great. Oh, I love that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, to sort of fulfill itself.
Yeah.
To be the most it can be, or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe okay, this is again getting out there, but maybe that aligns in some way with the almost platitudes people say about, well, human being is the universe being conscious of itself.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's something about our tapping into our consciousness, breed of our ordinary tactical strategic thinking, you
Right
know,
brain,
and our
right thinking. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, maybe there's something about that as well that is sort of, you know, what I'm really getting out there, but the,
No,
you
it's
know,
good. Yeah.
original nature, original consciousness, original mind wants to, you know, fulfill itself through human awakening or something.
Right.
I've heard things like that said in deep
Yeah.
spiritual traditions, but
Right.
maybe that's analogous almost to what happens when a poem
Yeah.
comes through. You know, it's there's some kind of fulfillment there
Yeah.
that maybe in some ways analogous to the experience of awakening. I mean, in moments of really radical awakening, when we lose our sense of self and we feel, you know, we're just not separate, and that, and you know, I think that's the most awake we can be. A person, it's the most awake I've ever been, is in those moments of real, what Zen calls kensho, when we're, you know, we're just, the self has, the idea of being a separate self has just gone, and they feel like some kind of fulfillment that's
Mhm.
more than my own. You know, those moments that, because there's I don't know whether that strikes a chord with you, John, but the first time I had one, you know, I've written about this when I was 19. I've talked about it as well, plenty. But, you know, it felt so fulfilling that I knew I could die that night and have been a completely fulfilled life. You
Wow.
know,
Wow.
I don't, so yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, again, I'm sorry, I'm taking us in tangents, but that, yeah, the poem somehow being analogous to that, that it's something, there's something so fulfilled and fulfilling about a really accomplished poem. You know, I'm not sure I've written one myself, by the way, but when I read them, you know, that this is, wow, how did this get to be so complete?
Yeah.
You know,
Like, how is this possible? You know, and
yeah,
in that sense, it's like it's another instance of like the best that humans are capable of. And that's, I think that's really life-giving to be reminded of that, because it's easy to forget, you know, because there's so much horror in the world. But these
yes,
moments of beauty, and, you know, I think that word's been banished from academia, but I'm glad we can still use it. um, but that's, you know, we want that. We want that.
yeah,
And that's, you know, that love of beauty, love of the beauty of the world is what's going to help us possibly save it, you know.
yeah,
And I think poetry's purpose in that sense is to is to is to remind us of our true nature, and of the beauty of the world, and how we might be in the world in a way that is more humble and appreciative and open. And yeah, but yeah, I love everything you said, Henry. I think that's all just absolutely right. I just resonated with all of that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Thanks. You know, I'm thinking now because of what you're saying about changing our way of being in the world. That seems so important. And I'm thinking of Seamus Heaney's book, The Redress of Poetry.
Mhm.
It's sort of, it's a long time since I read it, but I think it was his lectures that he gave when he was professor of poetry at Oxford. I think that's what that book is, if I remember right. But he's sort of saying, you know, yeah, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, but don't imagine that, you know, a poem will change the world. But on the other hand, poetry offers a redress to what, you know, kind of morally offends us. It's a redress of what's a redress toward what is
Yeah.
awry in the world, you
Right.
know. And I think that's, and I think possibly through that, the change of heart it can inspire in us can actually, I think,
Yeah.
can change the world, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it spreads.
Change of heart, change of consciousness.
Well, true.
Because
Yeah.
if there's not a collective awakening in terms of consciousness, whatever technical fixes we make are not gonna matter, really. And yeah, I think that's where poetry can have a huge impact on the level of heart, consciousness, and opening. Yeah, I love that redress of how did you say it? Of the aspects of the world that offend our sensibilities or that trample,
Yeah.
our finer nature. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
restoration of a right relationship to the world, which
Yes.
we've strayed so far from that, from a kind of kinship relationship with the world that our Stone Age ancestors certainly had.
Yeah, and you can still see it in indigenous wisdom today.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, amazing book, Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
I've just blanked on her name, but it's what a beautiful evocation of the kind of reciprocity that is endemic to a lot of indigenous thought, and that rapacious colonialist modern Europeans, or not only post medieval onwards, really just didn't have any sense of.
Well, wanted to destroy.
And what, yeah, well, yeah, absolutely, and had no no corrective to their extractive, exploitative instincts.
Yeah.
It's
And
so
the result of that.
exactly.
Yeah. Robin Wall Kimmerer is the
Thank
author
you.
of.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Um.
And I'm reading another book called Hospicing Modernity, which is a really radical
Wow.
book.
Wow.
But the author, and I can't remember her name, but she talks about how colonialism isn't just something that happened in the past. The coloniality is something that still governs the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about reality, the way we think about our relationships to the earth. And yeah, bringing awareness to that, it is, I think, just so crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am. Well, I don't want to cast stones, but I tend to think that there's an Abrahamic component here in the Western mind. And that's one of the reasons I call my new book Original Love, as a counter to original sin.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
because it seems the original sin of the West has been
Yeah.
those doctrines in the
Yeah.
early books of the Bible,
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Steve, I feel like we should bring you in.
Me
I mean, we
too.
could go on talking forever, it seems, but maybe you have something you'd like us to address, or you want to, yeah.
Well, before, I was asking about writing for an audience. And maybe there's a distinction that you've both teased out here, which is, it seems the poet doesn't write for an audience, not really, at least you don't. But you presumably publish for one. The instinct to share poetry that you've written presupposes an audience. Maybe it shouldn't, as you pointed out for most poets. Maybe even publishing shouldn't presuppose an audience. But anyway, and that seems like you've begun to explore some of the hopes you have for your poetic expression when it starts to leave your poetry book, your notebook, and goes out there into the world and is read by others. It has an impact, participates somehow out there, away from you. I wonder if that refines it at all. I'm also wondering about the time. I would like also to request, I don't know if this is appropriate. If you don't feel it's right, then just rebuff it. It would be nice to invite you both to read something of your own work. If anything from this discussion, comes through, this poem or that. I know what I'd nominate, but
Okay.
I'm curious. Yeah.
What would you, well, let's see. Not that I need to go first, but I did think of this poem in regard to something you were saying earlier, Henry, and this is a very short poem from No Day at the Beach. It's called Walk the Talk. And it's in very short couplets, in case it's like that. Sometimes I think human beings are just a way for words to walk around on earth, and words just a way for wind to hear itself think.
Wow. John, can we hear it again?
Yeah, yeah, walk the talk. Sometimes I think human beings are just a way for words to walk around on earth, and words just a way for wind to hear itself think.
Marvelous.
Wow. Oh, that's gorgeous.
Uh,
Oh.
yeah, just, a playful poem that maybe touches on something that's more than that, but yeah, fun to write. But
Mm.
what were you going to nominate, Steve? I'm happy to read anything.
Um, I think it's better. I think this is better. The two of you are going with it. Never mind me.
Yeah,
In this
yeah.
case.
Okay, so Henry, you have something you want to read?
Well, sure, but let me just I wanted to just not see if there was anything, John, you wanted to say about, Steve's question around
Oh,
what about when we publish,
yeah,
when we put them into a book and send them off
yeah.
in a little frail bark onto the high seas. What are we hoping? Yeah. Do you
And
have? Yeah.
I also might ought to interject that both of you have published to great acclaim, critical and otherwise. I ought to mention that
Hmm.
to frame the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can claim to have received great acclaim, but however, I will say that this little book, The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, has sold over 40,000 copies, which is astounding to me, and is still selling about 4,000 copies a year. And so, and people write to me. I mean, these are not my poems, but um, people write to me and talk about how important the book is to them. Often people who are going through an illness or the loss of a spouse or something of that nature. So I feel really good about that. And I feel like because of that book, I do have something of an audience. Whereas before that book, my other poetry books would sell like literally 2 or 3 or 400 copies, or maybe 5 or something over the course of 20 years, which is, it's nothing. So, well, it's not nothing, but it's not a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think I know for me, reading poems has changed my life. And I know that's a sort of cliched way to say it, but it's true. And so I have to believe that the potential is there, when a book goes out, to find its way to that one reader in the junk store or wherever, who might, come upon a poem that, lights something up, that creates this sense of aliveness that you were talking about, Henry. And that makes it all worth it. And I think it's true that people are turning to poetry more now than they have perhaps in the more recent past. I mean, somebody said in times of crisis, people turn to poetry. Well, we're in kind of a perpetual crisis now. And so I think people are drawn to poetry in a way that is encouraging. I think people are seeking it out and feeling the importance, the magnitude of poetry in a way that's encouraging.
Yeah. Hey, John, while we're kind of a little bit tuned into your voice, would you read another one? Because that was gorgeous and brief. So
Sure,
yeah.
sure. I'll I'll yeah, I'll read this poem, Swifts,
Oh yeah.
from the same book. It's a little bit longer, and it's in this new anthology, The Poetry of
Yeah.
Grief, Gratitude, and Reverence. And the Swifts, this is the time of year where they come through town and roost. Um, and this is kind of a elegy for my father. Swifts. Early fall, the light thin and brittle. And if it's true that deprivation is a gift, I accept the gift. I walk down to Wallace Park to watch the swifts that roost every September in the Chapman School's tall brick chimney. The charming swifts with their long forked tails and swept back wings, 10,000 of them swerving and darting in the evening sky, a flowing, expandable spiral of birds, clearing the air of insects and riveting the wandering human mind. Tonight, there must be 300 spectators, a whole hillside of us, ordinary people whose wings fell off eons ago, who traded flight for speech and have regretted it ever since. Sodden and earthbound as we are, except for our lifted eyes, our oohs and ahs that show we're still alive when the peregrine falcon dives in and knifes one out of the air, which we boo or cheer, sometimes simultaneously. We love this passion play of form and formlessness, the birds' shifting patterns flung out like a whiplash of water or school of fish above the stationary human school, then drawn tight together, a miracle they don't crash into each other, a miracle of echolocation until you see them as they truly are, a single organism, a body made mostly of air and quick decisions, jagged motions that gradually cohere, a poem, in other words. It takes the flock a full 20 minutes to funnel down into the chimney, and it seems a living smoke pulled back into a still and sleeping fire. So beautiful, I forget for a moment my father's death, or I turned my mind away from it, or no, I open my grief to accommodate this wonder and wonder what he might have thought of it, were we standing here together, the kind of thing we never did and now will never do, except in my imagination, that unchanging inner sky where the swifts take flight whenever I want them to, and my father cannot die.
Beautiful.
Yeah. No,
That's a really stunning poem. I've read that a couple of times now.
Thank you.
Several times, actually. Yeah. But fantastic.
Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. It's the, if I was in the room with you, you'd feel my glow and my heart opened by that. Oh.
I can feel it. Yeah. I can. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I love that. I love that. Oh, it's just spectacular. Yeah.
That means a lot, Henry. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
Yeah. But I'd love to hear some of your poems.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think I'm gonna I'm gonna read one that's related actually,
Great.
in theme, to your Swifts. It's I've got to say, well, I'm not going to say anything really. Actually, I'll just read it. I'll give a little, just to let everybody know that it's called Yahrzeit, which is the 1 year anniversary of a death in the Jewish world, and it's about a heron, so it's got a little bird thing going as well, but it's a different animal altogether, and I just want to say it's got the word weir in it. Weir is not everyone in the US knows what a weir is, although I think probably everyone in the British Isles knows what it is. It's a kind of dam that where the water can flow over on rivers and often associated with canals and channels and things. And it's a common thing in the British Isles, but not so common here in the US. So Yahrzeit. The young heron pauses in the middle of the weir to stare at me, and waits there so long on its single stilt, one webbed foot held aloft, the other planted in the pour of water, not a feather stirring, just the long neck adjusting for balance like a snake, and the hazel target of its eye locked on mine, that time stands still. The damp day turns bright. The elms sigh in a wind not made of air. The path under my feet softens like skin, and the river presses its cool hands on my ears. What is this pressure holding my head? Why am I remembering all of a sudden that today is the anniversary of your death, and wondering where you've gone 1 year on, or whether you've gone at all? Who is this bird fixing me with its eye? Stately as an Egyptian prince, as if wearing time like a pair of wings, it has only to open to bring back all the years of your life. At last, it lowers its foot and moves on.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah.
beautiful. Just incredible. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I actually misread a line. That's the sound of the river presses its cool hands on my ears. So if that sounded a bit strange, that's what.
How did you say it in the poem?
I think I said just the river presses its cool hands over my ears. The sound of the river presses its cool hands over my ears.
That's how I kind of sensed that.
You took it? Okay, good.
But God, there's so much I want to say. I mean, it feels like it embodies so much of what we've been talking about here. This quality of awakening and luminosity and stopping and connecting. I mean, the fact that this bird is looking, staring into your eyes, on this momentous date. And just the writing is just so gorgeous. What was the line about the wings? As if time.
Oh yeah, as if wearing time like a pair of wings. Yeah.
Wearing time like a pair of wings, which is then what's the rest of it?
Oh, as if wearing time like a pair of wings that has only to open to bring back all the years of your life. Actually, by the way, it's about my dad. It was after my dad's death. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's such an incredible turn in the poem, because that takes us then to the father and the loss and it's beautiful, Henry. Yeah. I love it. Yeah.
That's actually one from the new book, Original Love. So.
Oh, great. Yeah. So that book has prose and poems.
Yes, much more prose.
Okay. But that poem's in it. I'm glad to know that, because I want to read the poem again. So, wow. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, we had a short one and a long one from John. And we've had a long one, perhaps a short one, Henry. Something along the lines of Finis Ter, perhaps. Something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's very short. Yeah. So, Finis Ter is both a peninsula in Brittany, northwest France, and a part of Portugal, also in the northwest corner of Portugal. And of course, it means end of the land. There's Land's End in the UK as well, at the end of Cornwall. But all three of them pointing out to the Atlantic Ocean, the great ocean, So this is just a little thing, really. Finis Ter. Yes, the land ends here. But every sailor knows this is where the journey begins. The voyage starts here.
Nice. I love it. Oh, I love it. I love short poems. I love the way they just drop us. They just into this huge opening that they've created. It's beautiful. Yeah, this is where the voyage begins.
Well, thank you both. I don't know what to say, really. This exceeded my already rather high expectations, and we've ended in just the most wonderful way.
Absolutely.
I'm in a sort of, I'm on a boat right now. I'm in sort of boat heaven. I'm just a mess now after that. That was wonderful. Thank you both.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Henry. It's so great to connect with you in this way.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, John. It's really lovely to connect with you in this very, most deep way for me. There's almost nothing I prefer, this kind of connection. And Steve, it's so great of you to very selflessly kind of arrange it and sort of step back and just let us explore what we most want to explore. I really, really appreciate you creating the space for that.
Yeah, likewise, Steve. That was wonderful that you just created this space and let it unfold as it would, and that there's a deep talent, skill to doing that. And not everybody has it. Yeah.
Thank you both. Well, this has been marvelous. Henry Shukman and John Brehm, thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah,
bye.
Thank you.
Wow. Bloody hell.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.